Hello everyone. This is Myriam Neaimeh from Newcastle University and the Alan Turing Institute. Welcome to the Supergen Smart Charging webinar series. The webinar is an activity of the Vehicle Grid Integration Group at the Alan Turing Institute. The Turing is the National Institute for Data Science and AI. And one of the objectives of the Institute is to apply data science to real-world problems, such as what we are doing at the Vehicle Integration Group, where we are applying and developing methods to help decarbonize the transport and electricity infrastructure. We've had already several episodes covering communication protocols for the electric vehicle ecosystems. We also had some companies share their experiences from implementing smart charging strategies in the real world, and we had talks about regional and national electric vehicle rollouts. You can find on our landing page previous slides, and also we have a YouTube playlist for the previous episodes. Currently, we are going through a series of talks on cybersecurity, and this is in collaboration with the International Energy Agency Task 43 on Vehicle Grid Integration. Okay, this is from a paper we recently published in collaboration with a colleague in DTU. And what this diagram is showing is on the bottom is the battery electric vehicle connected to the charger, the EV supply equipment. And that charger is either directly connected to a third-party operator, such as an aggregator or an energy supplier, or it is being controlled through an energy management system. One of the things I'd like to understand today is if we do go through the smart metering route, how does that work? Would the smart metering would be a third option, or are we able to use the smart metering with the energy management system? So as I mentioned, we're doing right now a cybersecurity series, and Daryl will be talking about the cybersecurity of smart meters and how it can be applied to EV charging. Check our website to register for the previous talks. Daryl is the security lead for the smart metering implementation program at BEIS. He has over 20 years experience in key technical and executive positions, and he's the Chief Operational Officer and co-founder of an ethical phishing and cybersecurity consultancy, which help organizations improve their resilience against cyber attacks. Without further ado, Daryl, over to you.
Thanks, Myriam. So welcome everybody. I'll just go through the process of sharing my screen. So hopefully this should appear quite shortly. 1 second. Is that sharing now, Myriam? Sorry, Myriam, can you just confirm if that's sharing for me just before I start?
Yeah, that's better.
Great, thank you. So welcome everybody. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking through the cybersecurity of smart metering and how it can be applied to EV charging. So I've been following the presentations in the series to date, and hopefully this session will help to add to the valuable contributions that have already been provided. So a key outline of some of the things I'll be looking to cover is I'll be talking about the challenge that we had from a smart metering point of view, some high-level security principles that we started out with and how they evolved, the roles and responsibilities of the key sort of entities that are involved, the approach we took to securing smart metering. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this just to drill into the details of how we went about looking at the risk assessment methodology, the trust modeling exercise that we went through, how we went about securing communications, so how we categorize the commands that we send into critical and non-critical commands, how we look after sensitive data, and how we manage all of that with PKIs. I'll then apply how we think that it could work with smart metering, with smart EV chargers, and I'll provide a brief summary with some key takeaways. So the outline of the challenge. So government considers cybersecurity as fundamental to the successful development and the wide adoption of smart metering. The deployment of large numbers of devices with the ability to switch loads on and off presents a real risk to both devices, the networks they connect to, as well as the wider electricity system. So BEIS is a lead government department responsible for the C&I risk in this area. And so we required security controls backed by independent assurance to ensure that the architecture was secure. The whole purpose being that there was no single compromise that should have a systemic or a significant impact to the wider system. So our work in this area wasn't done in isolation. We worked in cooperation with leading industry experts and others in government, including the National Cybersecurity Centre, who are part of GCHQ. And the following slides will hopefully provide a high-level overview of the security approach and controls that we employ to achieve this and how they can be applied to smart EV chargers. So like all good cybersecurity aspects on a large program, we came up with some initial high-level security principles, and these are not in any particular order, by no means fully complete, but they give a sense of the kind of things that we were thinking about. So we wanted to minimize a number of points of potential attacks. We wanted to minimize the risk to critical national infrastructure in general. We wanted to place trust with responsible parties. Now that's a point that I'll come on to in a lot more detail in the trust modeling exercise aspect. We want to provide an acceptable customer experience. So if we're going to put 53 million devices into consumers' homes, we want to make sure that the experience that they get from that is valuable and suitable for the end requirement. Obviously, we're concerned with mitigating risk to energy supply disconnection, but also we're concerned around other aspects such as financial fraud, data privacy, and the availability of the system. We want to minimise barriers of entry to new energy sector participants. And where possible, we wanted to future-proof the system. So that's coping with future changes to the business process and also providing headroom for additional security controls as new threats emerged. So jumping onto the roles and responsibilities, we've effectively got sort of three core areas. So at the top there, we have the government. And so the UK government is principally interested in risks to national security. So therefore, we provide a lot of the threat information and advise on the security risks to sort of other participants. Over on the left-hand side, we've got the energy sector as such, so things like energy suppliers, network operators, those sorts of things. Now, because they're responsible for rolling out all of the secure smart metering systems and they're responsible for the retail side of the business, their principal interest is obviously to manage that rollout and to ensure that any risk to that revenue that they're responsible for is sort of secure and able to prevent fraud. Then over on the right-hand side, we've got Ofgem. So Ofgem are principally interested in consumer protection, and they're also responsible for license and code enforcement aspects. And I'll spend quite a bit of time coming up in the slides talking about the different licenses and the codes that are involved. And obviously there are other regulations as well. So BEIS and Ofgem are also the joint competent authorities for the NIS directive as well. So starting out with how we approached smart metering, and I'll go through sort of a cycle of process of all of the key aspects that we went through, but all good approaches to cybersecurity generally start with a risk assessment, and that's no different in this instance. So we effectively looked at all of the risks, and by risks here, this is how we work out sort of what the threat and likelihood is against the impact, and we use industry standard methodologies, which I'll come on to as we progress through. So we're now on the 7th iteration of the risk assessment for smart metering. It's based on intelligence and threat that we received from the National Cybersecurity Centre. It's basically a methodical approach we took to identifying all of the key risks. It gets reviewed annually, which I'll come on to a little bit later in the slides. And to give you an idea, there's probably around 320 risks that we manage, all of varying sort of severities. And I'm now going to go through and highlight the 7 key steps we undertook as part of our risk assessment methodology. So step 1 is around defining the system model that provides an overview of the system and its component parts. So I'll hopefully use the laser pointer on here to help with this. So over on the right-hand side, we've got all of the energy market participants, so energy suppliers, network operators, and third parties. And then obviously they communicate with the big box in the middle, which is what we call the DCC. Now I've kept some of the organisation names on here for this first slide, just so you can see that it's not just sort of one organisation that looks after the DCC. So what we have is we have the data service provider, which effectively manages all the messages going through. So CGI manages that, and it goes through and has all these different controls on, which I'll spend a bit more time on later. We've got the smart metering key infrastructure, so our PKI infrastructure, which is all managed by British Telecom. There's a load of back office systems that DCC has, which is all run by Capital IT Services. And then we have the routing network. So in the north of the country, we have Arqiva, who manage the north, and in the central and south, we have Telefonica. And then that wide area network goes into people's homes via a comms hub, and you've got the various devices in the home. So you've got the gas meter, the electricity meter, you'll have the in-home display, which will show sort of consumption data for the consumer, and it's where other devices can connect to. So we have things like consumer access devices, which can also capture consumption data, and things like energy smart appliances can also come in, which Nina Klein, a colleague of mine, spoke about in a previous webinar. There's also another device down here called the APC, which is probably worth spending a couple of minutes time on, because I'll be spending a bit of time talking about that later on. So the APC is effectively an auxiliary proportional controller. This is a new load control device which builds on existing load control switches in the home area network. It's effectively a more precise and flexible way of controlling load in the home via the smart meter than is currently possible. So currently you can have an auxiliary load controller switch that is quite a binary in nature, so it's either on or it's off, but this auxiliary proportional controller will provide grades up from 0 to 100, so you can measure and control the load as it goes through. And that functionality will be available from November this year, although the technical specifications for it are available now. So you define the system model, and then you move on to step 2. And step 2 is where you catalogue all of the information assets and undertake a business impact assessment. If we take a specific asset identifier, we'd have something like an in-home display, which I've just touched on. You have a description of the notes, and then you'd carry out an impact assessment. So the assets could be anything. So it could be smart meters, it could be comms hubs, it could be the IHDs, it could be DCC, the WAN, energy suppliers. But this CIA is something I'm going to spend a little bit more time on in the next slide. So as some of you who work in cybersecurity might be aware, you've got the sort of cybersecurity triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So confidentiality is all about data not being made available or disclosed to unauthorized entities or individuals or processes. Availability is the ability to keep the systems up or the data available, ensure that they can function when they are needed. And then the integrity side is to maintain and ensure the accuracy and completeness of data over its entire life cycle. So these 3 aspects of confidentiality, integrity, and availability are what we will apply to each aspect of our risk assessment to ensure we're looking against each of those. So on step 3, we define and assess the threat sources based upon the capability and their motivation. So by threat sources, we mean those that may wish for the system to be compromised. So for example, it may be a state-sponsored group, for example. And so we put these into a table, so you can see I've given an example here of a state-sponsored group, and you'd provide a rationale of why a state-sponsored group might want to target this asset. And then you look at the different properties, and then you look at the capability. So the capability levels could be anything from sort of very little capability up to formidable. And then you look at the priority over here, and the priority again could be anything from very low and indifferent to very high and very focused. And then that will effectively give you the threat level of whether it's a negligible threat level or whether it's severe and critical. And then you have the source of where that threat assessment has come from, whether it's come from a sort of threat management platform, whether it's come from intelligence sources. And then you also look at whether they can be influenced at all, and also who the sort of threat actors would be. And I'll come on to threat actors next. So step 4 is around combining some of these assets together into logical groupings and assessing what those worst case business impacts would be. So if we take the consumer premises, for example, you can see there's a number of assets in here with the in-home display, electricity meter. So you create a focus of interest, as we call it, in the consumer premises, and you list all of the assets, and you provide a rationale for why each of those are in there and the impacts it could have. Then you carry out those impacts against the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And what you're looking to do is say, well, of all of the assets in this focus of interest, what's the worst case scenario that can be achieved from that? And then we actually start the real core work of the risk assessment process. So we define and assess all of the threat actors. So the threat actors in this case are those that may actually carry out the attacks on the system. So it could be a physical intruder, it could be a person within range of the home area network. There are others, such as sort of privileged users inside an organization, or a normal user or a handler that may tamper with equipment. And so you can see that the tables are getting slightly more complex, but as you can see over here, you've got the threat actor types, You've got the native capability, which at the clearance level, security clearance levels, the native capability, which again would be anything from very little to formidable. You've got the native motivation, again, whether it's very low motivation or whether they're highly focused. You've then got the threat level, which is obviously a combination of capability and motivation. We also look at this aspect here, which is quite important, where you look at what the dominant influencing threat sources are. So it might be somebody who's a insider within an organization, but they might be getting influenced by a nation state. So at that point, you've got to look at sort of what the enhanced capabilities and the enhanced motivations would be, come up with what the total threat level would be. And so as you can see, you carry this out across all of the different threat actors. And this would then lead you on to the next stage, which is where we look at all of the focus of interest, where we consider all of the risks that are applicable to each of those threat actors. So this is identify all of the different viable compromise methods which could be used by a threat actor to compromise any one of these aspects. So if we take a look here, you can see we've got the focus of interest here is a consumer premises. The person is authorized to be within the physical proximity. And then you'd look at all the threat actor types and their clearance levels and who's influencing them. And then you'd look at all of the different compromise methods as well. So whether somebody would look to attack it from capturing information from the WAN, whether people would like to sort of physically take a part of a meter or something like that. And then you'd look at all of that in combination with the threat level and the risk level, and that's how you come up with your risk assessment. It's important to note that this gives you sort of a generic inherent risk of what the threats are. But what you need to do is then a data mapping to look at all of those compromise methods in a lot more detail. And that comes out when we look at how we're looking to treat all of these risks, which comes into a risk treatment plan. So the risk treatment plan obviously follows all of the expected standards that you expect, so things like ISO 27005. But what you're expecting from the risk treatment plan is to get a set of controls that will show you what the residual risks after treatments are. So once each risk has been identified, you look at what those risks are, and then you look at all of the different types of controls you can apply to reduce that overall risk. So the security controls identified will be a combination of detective and preventative. So being able to detect when something happens, but also stopping those things from happening in the first place. And the risk treatment plan identifies all of those controls which will inform the security requirements document. So that brings me on to the next slide. This is a 7-step process of going through a risk assessment. And this is something that we repeat every year or when major changes happen to the architecture. And it's important that you take this methodical approach because at any point you could have new connections or new actors coming in, and that's why it's all based on the initial threat intelligence. So moving on to the security requirements, once you've carried out your risk assessment. So we've got a security requirements document in smart metering, and this document incorporates organizational, governance and technical requirements that apply to smart metering equipment, DCC systems and user systems. So the scope of the security requirements includes the interfaces of smart metering devices with third-party devices, but it excludes functionality associated with those devices because the functionality is in the technical specifications, which I'll come on to later. So the requirements within this document are largely enforceable via a regulatory framework overseen by the authority, which is Ofgem, and I'll spend a bit more time on Ofgem a little bit later too. This is also reviewed annually as part of all of the risk assessment work, and this is to ensure that there's traceability back to any of the risks that we have. So as an example, in this document, you'll have lots of requirements that list out what the requirement is, a unique identifier, an explanation of that requirement, and then where in the regulations that requirement is enforced. So as you can see, getting full logical traceability all of the way through. So once you've got your security requirements, we then go on to applying all of that to a security architecture. So the security architecture is another document that we have. It's approximately 130 pages long, and it basically lists the end-to-end smart metering system, which includes the devices within the premises, the DCC systems, and the user systems. And by user systems here, I mean the sort of IT infrastructure used by energy suppliers and network operators to communicate with the devices. Now, in order to produce this security architecture, there was a key process that we undertook to identify what the appropriate security controls were. And so a lot of this was derived from something called a trust modeling exercise that we undertook. So I'll spend a little bit of time on trust modeling because it's a really important methodical approach to understand how we got to our architecture. So the SWIP trust models were a key output, and we undertook it in coordination with CESG, which is now NCSC, supporting us. And the purpose of the trust modelling exercise was to ensure that reliance is placed on each part of the end-to-end architecture, and it was only arising as a direct consequence of core business aims. We weren't just coming up with good security controls that we thought were best practice, we were actually applying security controls based on where trust was needed. And this was for twofold. This was to ensure that the programme avoided unnecessary levels of assurance and the associated costs that that introduced, also to avoid exposure to additional threats and risks. And I'm going to go through that trust modelling exercise, which is a 6-step process next, just to give you an idea about it. So the step 1 in any trust modelling exercise is to develop a series of abstract business models assuming no solutions and no constraints. So something incredibly simple. So for example, a meter manufacturer providing a consignment of meters to the supplier. Now we've used meters here, but it could be anything. It could be smart EV chargers, it could be heat pumps, it could be anything like that. And I've obviously simplified this business process to just one aspect. Then once you've got that initial business process, you need to identify the trust relationships that must be in place for the business process to operate effectively. So this is important because it defines a reliance that one participant will be able to place upon another party. So if we take our example, the trust relationship in this example is that the supplier needs to be able to trust the manufacturer to provide clean, secure, compliant meters with the identities provided for those meters, e.g. to avoid malicious accidental operation of those meters once they're installed. So as you can see, all of the things I'm listing out here are likely to apply to sort of other aspects or other devices that are going to have a control in load control. Then the third step is to overlay that generic architecture, identifying participants and connections and interactions and those sorts of enabling functions. So I've got a really high level view of smart metering here, and it's in a very generic architecture. And what we'd do from our very simple business case is we'd overlay what those key participants are, what the connections are, what the interactions are, and those enabling functions. So in this case, it would be that the meter manufacturer needs a structure to provision globally unique IDs. It's also going to need to be able to include, at manufacturing, a unique meter ID point. And so we've obviously used a very simple example here, but it's also the method that we use to identify additional controls. So for example, looking at anomaly detection. And I'll come on to anomaly detection a little bit later because it's quite a key security control. But it's also other controls around where authentication is required. So the purpose of this approach really is that it provides a commensurate and appropriate security at the place where it's most needed. And so if we go on to step 4, this is where we develop security related consequences. And these take into account specific constraints. And you can, from that, derive a set of reliances that must be placed on each part of the architecture. So the constraints we're talking about here could be anything from compute power or technology capability or cost. But if I go on to what those sort of an example of those security related consequences, using our example of a meter manufacturer providing meters. So the supplier must assure all of the relevant aspects of its meter supply chain to ensure that its compliance meters are manufactured. The manufacturer then got to create these globally unique identifiers for its meter, and they've got to have, e.g., physical serial numbers and electronic identifiers. Then a suitable structure will need to be defined in order to support all of these globally unique identifiers. So you can see how these security consequences start leading on to other security requirements. So then once you've got all of those aspects, you compare the derived security consequences with the current intentions of the program, and then you need to look at where there's a lack of alignment. So are there any substantive reasons, for example, that mean that the program might need to take a different approach to any of the things it's mandated? So would one of these security controls introduce huge significant cost that is unbearable? Or would they are there constraints on existing technology that prevent some of these things from being put into place? And it's at that point that the program and the security team needs to decide if it needs to revise its position or whether all of the controls it's defining are appropriate. Then the final step is to identify the resulting public and private security information requirements. So this is needed to ensure integrity and authenticity of messages sent to and from the parties, including for non-repudiation purposes. So in some specific cases, the security information may need to provide encryption to ensure confidentiality is maintained. For example, if there's private consumption data in data being sent backwards and forwards. And this will apply again to other devices such as smart EV chargers and other similar type devices. So that's the 6-step trust modeling process that we went through. And it's although it's taken a little bit of time to go through it, I think it's really important to provide a highlight to it. It helps to ensure that reliance is placed on each part of the end-to-end architecture It was only arising as a direct consequence of those core business aims. So it provides for important proportionality in the right places. And this is especially true when it comes to communications. So how we went about securing communications was that in the SMIP architecture, we distinguish between different message types to the devices with different security arrangements assigned to each of those. So for example, we have critical commands. And so these are commands which relate to anything that can affect supply, anything that could lead to financial fraud, or the compromise of the security of the device. And so for critical commands, trust must be maintained end to end. So by that, we mean that the supplier and the meter will need to ensure that there's trust end to end. So to do that, we require three things. So we require authenticity, integrity, and non-repudiation. We've got to ensure that it's authentic. We've got to make sure it's not been changed. We've got to have end-to-end trust between the two. And we achieve this through a digital signature. Now, I won't go into too many details on sort of digital signatures here because I can cover that off in the questions if there are any towards the end. So the second key aspect for these critical messages is that it must be a two-party authorization. So because they're critical going to a device, we want to ensure that there's another party separate to the meter and the energy supplier that checks that everything's okay. And in this case, this is the DCC in our instance that countersigns it. And it uses a message authentication code, or a MAC code, as we call it from a cryptographic point of view. So those were the critical commands. We also have non-critical commands. So non-critical commands are effectively anything that's not a critical command, which kind of makes it a little bit more straightforward. So if a supplier wishes to display a customer identification number on the consumer's smart meter, for example, that would be classed as a non-critical command. So for these commands, we just require authenticity and integrity. So we achieve this again just through a MAC code being applied to it. So for non-critical commands, we don't require non-repudiation. This is because it would require the meter to check the energy supplier's digital signature. And because from a cryptographic point of view, that's quite a relatively processor-intensive operation, by working through our trust modeling exercise, which I touched on previously, that showed that for non-critical commands, this level of security was appropriate and proportionate for these types of commands. Then the other types of data that it's important to look at really is sensitive data. So this is information that must be kept secret, so anything that contains personal information, such as consumption data. So for here, obviously, we want to make sure we've got confidentiality. So this is where we want to make sure that when the meter sends that information back, that consumption data is encrypted and only be decrypted by the relevant users. And obviously, from a decryption point of view and access to private information, we have a whole host of privacy frameworks and smart metering that all of the users that have access to the information have to apply to. And obviously, they have to ensure that they get all of the appropriate consents from the consumer. And again, all of this information will be equally applicable to things like smart EV chargers. And so when we've got all of these communications going backwards and forwards, it's important to be able to manage them in some way. So as energy suppliers are responsible for the device, only they can send supply affecting commands in the smart metering model. Now, I'll come on to sort of how that may change in the future towards the end of the slides when we talk about applying it to EV chargers. So to secure this, smart metering utilizes a public key infrastructure approach to securing and managing the distribution of digital certificates which attest to the authenticity of a sender. So I know in previous webinars, there's been quite a bit of work done on PKIs. So I won't go into the details of what PKIs are, but I will describe a little bit about how we go about it on smart metering. So the PKI effectively relies on all parties trusting the root certificate authority, and become trusted, you must become a subscriber and obtain a digital certificate. So SMICI, as we call it, smart metering key infrastructure, has multiple routes for different purposes to enable the use of public key cryptography to secure these communications. So the PKIs include governance policies, procedures, technologies and techniques, and together these all provide our secure technical and legal infrastructure for controlling the creation and certification of public keys. And it also creates a distribution and management for those public keys as well. So we have three sort of key routes on the left-hand side there at the bottom. We have the OCA, which is for organisation. So anyone becoming an organisation within the smart metering energy code, they all need to have organisation certs. We have device certificates that go on all the devices. And then we have ICI, which is the infrastructure. So this authenticates all of the access to smart metering. So they're all managed by a trusted provider, which I touched on in my sort of overview architecture slide. And then there's also another PKI route that the data service provider has for all of its internal communications as well. There are other PKIs that are involved around things like ZigBee smart energy standards as well. So we've spoken about the risk assessment, the security requirements, the security architecture. So once you have all of those controls in place, we need some way of ensuring everyone follows the rules. So effectively, you need a rule book. And what we have here is a license that effectively is the rule book that lists the key activities and undertakings that, in this case, an energy supplier needs to undertake. There's also licenses for network operators and the DCC2. Now, the license points predominantly for smart metering to the smart energy code for the detail of what must be complied with. So therefore, we have the smart energy code. And so this is an extract off of the CECAS website who look after smart energy code. And it's quite a lofty tome. It's a couple of thousand pages long, but there are some key aspects within here that we're interested in from a security point of view. So we have section G, which you may not be able to see there, which is security. We have section I on data privacy, and then we have section L, which is the SMICI and DCC key infrastructure. And so they're the ones where all the requirements are laid down that people need to follow. So if I look at the smart energy code for a moment, when we go to section G, there's a whole list of controls in here that an entity must adhere to. So it must be 27001 compliant, it must carry out 27005 risk assessments, security screening checks, penetration testing done by approved accreditation bodies, separation of duties to be able to detect and prevent unauthorized access, detection and prevention of unauthorized software execution, how they detect and manage anomalous events. They need things for processes for incident management, how they protect cryptographic key material. There's a whole area on locating certain aspects within the UK, the geographical restriction processes, business continuity and disaster recovery. And there's a list of requirements on them to report certain things. And I've got the SSC on here, which I'll cover a little bit later. But parties need to notify of material security vulnerabilities. They need to notify of security incidents, and they've got a duty to notify vendors if they spot vulnerabilities. And they've also got a duty to patch when they're notified by vendors of those vulnerabilities. So everything we want a smart metering participant to undertake from a security point of view is pretty much listed out in the smart energy code. But we have other regulatory instruments as well. So there's a whole host of device specifications that we have for different devices. So for smart metering equipment, technical specifications that cover a lot of devices. We've got devices like the comms hubs, the HCALCs, which are hand-connected auxiliary load controllers. We've got GBCS as well. So it's probably worthwhile talking about GBCS for a short moment, because it's a related document that specifies a single consistent technical implementation in a sufficient level of detail to achieve operational interoperability of devices. So if you're going to create a system where you want devices to talk, it's important to have standards. And you may remember, if you've not seen it, I'd recommend you sort of watch it from last week. Nina Klein talking around the work that BEIS is doing on some of these standards with BSI on PASs. And that's what they're looking to do, is to try to get some technical standards on how communications will work for devices and things like demand side response. So another regulatory instrument we have is something called CPA security characteristics. Now I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the CPA process a little bit later. But for CPA security characteristics, there are certain devices where we require them to be built to be able to meet certain additional security requirements over and above what's in the technical specifications. So, for example, we really care about the electricity meter and gas meter and HCALCs because they can control load. And obviously the comms hub is the communications conduit into the home. We've also got the standalone proportional load controller here as well. So I spoke about the APC earlier on. This is a standalone version of that which connects to the hand. And this will be available from the security characteristics point of view in November this year to enable manufacturers to start building to those security requirements. And when we look at the regulatory instruments around this, effectively what this lists is all of the, I've got the electricity meter here, for example, all of the logical entities that you would expect in there. So interface protection, message protection, firmware protection, etc. UTRN, for those that don't know, is a unique transaction reference number for sort of prepay aspects. And then obviously logging. And then what we do is we take all of those logical aspects, there's a whole list of security requirements that the device must meet. So for example, there are development mitigations. And so these are measured through the integration into the development of a product during its implementation. So an independent test lab will check all of this during evaluation. There are then verification mitigations. So these are measures that an evaluator must test or observe during the evaluation process, so they're physically observing or testing themselves. And then there are deployment mitigations. So these are measures that describe the deployment of the device and how it must operationally be controlled. So these are largely used by system administrators and users to ensure that the product is securely deployed. And I've given an example there of what a dev mitigation would look like, but I'll leave you to sort of review that at your leisure and on the sort of YouTube version. So we have the requirements, we have the security architecture, we've got the regulatory instruments. But how do you ensure that everyone does what they're supposed to do? So that's why we have an assurance framework. Going back to my example of the architecture earlier on, we've got the energy market participants, and I'll focus on those first. So I've just touched on all of the things that they must comply with from a smart energy code perspective. So they all get independently assured by something called a CIO, which is a competent independent organisation. They effectively check all those organisations to make sure that they are doing everything they should be here. So making sure that before they connect to the smart metering system, they've had their risk assessments and they've passed all their security assessments. And then after that, on a regular basis, ensuring they're still complying with all these aspects. Any organisation that can perform load control, which in our world for smart metering is currently only energy suppliers, but obviously I'll touch on how that could change later, also have their licence conditions that I've touched on too. In the middle, the DCC, well, they're assured by CIO audits too. So whilst the DCC was being built, it had to pass all of the sort of design, build and test requirements. And then obviously whenever there's any major changes to the DCC, they also go through a CIO audit. So for example, we've got a large program of work to enrol first generation smart metering devices at the moment into the DCC. So before they get enrolled, the DCC has to undertake all of those CIO audits independently. There's also T-Scheme. So T-Scheme is a body that looks at trust schemes effectively. So when we're talking about that, we're talking about the smart metering key infrastructure here. So they'll go in annually and make sure that all the policies and processes that are written down in the certificate policy statements and practice statements are all being adhered to. And then we look at the whole of the DCC annually as well via SOC 2 audits, which is a sort of large scale independent audit of all of those things put together. And then on the final piece over on the left hand side, as I've touched on, we've got CPA of devices. So the actual process itself consists of an assessment of the manufacturer of the device against the build standard. So making sure that they're doing all the good things as a vendor and as a manufacturer. And then their product itself needs to comply with all of those security characteristic things that I listed out on the previous slide. So what that effectively means is that a manufacturer must pass the build standard, their product must get tested, they need to agree an ongoing assurance management approach for changes that come through. Then if they pass all of those things, the product will get certified, and any changes after that will have to go through its ongoing assurance maintenance process. So all of those things put together give you an end-to-end life cycle throughout the whole of the smart metering architecture of having assurance in every place that is specific to all of those aspects. And so when I bring that round to our life cycle, we've got our assurance. So once you've got all of your assurance of your end-to-end aspects, how do you ensure that the security of the end-to-end solution is maintained and it's updated? Well, for that, you need a governance framework. And so from a governance perspective, because all of the main controls are listed out in the Smart Energy Code, there's a Smart Energy Code panel that looks after the Smart Energy Code and the administration of that. And so they delegate security responsibilities down to the Security Subcommittee, who meet fortnightly. So they've got a whole host of security responsibilities to maintain certain documents. So a lot of those documents I touched on earlier, such as the risk assessment, the end-to-end architecture, the risk treatment plans, security controls framework, which is a framework that effectively is a plain language framework of what organisations need to do to comply with the SEC, the evidence that would be expected for them to have to meet those, then all those security characteristics. And all these things get reviewed annually or on major changes. And then the SSC also monitors and advises the SEC panel on anything to do with security for sort of users in the DCC. They also look at all the anomaly detection aspects as well. On the right-hand side, where we've got our PKI aspects, we've got the SMICI PMA. So this is a policy management administration board. So they look after all of those documents to do with the PMA. So this is all those governance documents that I mentioned as well. Then under that are some various subgroups exist. So if there's a smart metering cybersecurity incident, and there's a subset of the SSC that would respond to that, then there are various subgroups that are brought together for sort of modifications to the Smart Energy Code too. And there's also a security group that's a closed security group in smart metering called the Smart Metering Information Exchange. This is where we share information, confidential information on security incidents that relate to smart metering. We learn lessons from each other. We understand what the latest attacks are. And that's all worked in conjunction with NCSC as a sharing forum for our part of the sector. So there you have the approach that we took to securing the smart metering system. It's a full life cycle approach. It covers every aspect, and it's something that we go through on a regular basis that is completely ongoing and never ends. And you can see how something like this could be equally applicable to any other type of activity that would potentially impact critical national infrastructure in the energy sector. So I'll spend a little bit of time now just covering how I believe sort of smart EV chargers could work with smart metering. So it's probably worth covering a little bit of what was discussed in the last webinar for those who didn't attend. OLEV has been, and OLEV, for those that don't know, is a team that works across government to support the early market for ultra-low emissions vehicles. And it's made up of sort of members from the Department of Transport and Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. But OLEV has recently published a summary of responses to its EV smart charging consultation from last year. And the consultation proposed smart metering as a current lead option for delivery of smart charging, given its ability to deliver on a couple of key objectives around consumer protection and grid protection. But OLEV are also asked for evidence and views on alternative approaches. And so before any decisions are made on this, OLEV's intention is to consult further before taking any decisions on a long-term solution for smart charging. Therefore, the approach that I'm going to sort of lay out in the next couple of slides is a suggestion of how smart charging could be delivered in the UK. Obviously, it's always going to be subject to OLEV's further consultation. But it's worth also saying that the smart metering programme does have a number of pilots in flight at the moment on testing smart EV chargers with the smart metering system. So going back to our sort of end-to-end architecture, it's probably worthwhile talking around the first types of communications when we're talking about sort of smart EV chargers. So there's a very basic input, which could be a manual input directly in at the charger via, for example, the APC or the standalone proportional controller. And this would be sort of setting flexibility status and things like that. Now, because this is direct manual input, then the security controls here would be reliant on the security controls of the device itself, making sure it's obviously physically secure and it couldn't be sort of compromised, or if it were compromised, the right alerts would be sent. However, when it comes to sending load control information over a network of some kind, then we'd need additional controls around those aspects. So when we're looking at those additional controls, anything to do with load control, we'd expect to follow the processes that need to be followed for smart metering. So when we're talking about load control here, it could be load control directly, or it could be informing load control. So for example, whether it's someone with an app changing an activity, then all of that information needs to come through an entity that's effectively in our energy market participants. So I touched on earlier, currently it's only energy suppliers that can control load. So in order to control load at the moment in smart metering, you'd need to be an energy supplier or go through the process that the energy supplier goes through to be able to meet those aspects. But there are opportunities in the future to widen that to other entities, whether that's smart EV charge point operators or demand side response service providers. But the key point here, sticking to the trust model end to end, is that anyone who's controlling load needs to have been regulated and assured, as we do for all of these parties, to make sure all their systems are appropriate. What it also means is that all of these aspects here, any communication that's coming over here that this entity is relying on, is going to need to have a whole host of controls to make sure that they can trust those aspects, and that the amount of control that's needed to look at volumes and all those sorts of things are important. I sort of touched on anomaly detection earlier, but what anomaly detection does here is it checks that commands that come from these entities are in the within certain thresholds in terms of volumes, and that they've got the right attributes. So it's effectively protecting the devices at this end from compromise at this end. So you can see why it's incredibly important to have all of these different checks and anomaly detection processes in place. You're talking about load that, if en masse, affecting aggregation of millions of homes, could have an impact to the energy sector. The next slide is talking around a sort of potential hybrid model. So when you've not got load affecting commands or load informing commands, there is the option that it could flow outside of that infrastructure. So of course, if it was flowing outside of that infrastructure, then there's different controls that are going to be needed across this link. Now, we would expect you're still going to want to have authenticity and integrity of those commands. And then depending on the content that's going across it, you might also need confidentiality if it's private. So how you achieve that, if you're not using these aspects would need to be reviewed. So, for example, we've got all of our PKIs, we've got all of our authentication, we've got our encryption, we've got our anomaly detection. All of those aspects would potentially need to be applied across this link as well. And so other communication paths we'd probably expect would go through all the processes that we've had to go through. So carrying out all of those things from my life cycle of threat assessments, risk assessments, etc. So now I'm aware this is a much simplified version of a diagram, and the devil's always in the details of types of communications, who has access to what. But the fundamental principle here is that if you can control load on a large scale, they would expect you to be sort of heavily looked at in this area to ensure that you're doing the right things. And so it's worthwhile going through a quick summary on those aspects. From a smart metering point of view, we've been through the process of creating a secure, interoperable solution for smart metering. And it's not easy, and it does take time to achieve and implement correctly. Because of the impacts it can have, doing it properly is the right way to do it. So we embedded our security in from the outset to ensure the solution was secure by design and to avoid having to retrofit requirements after the event. So we have developed technical specifications and security characteristics for our load control devices to ensure those devices are interoperable and secure. We have a secure and assured national platform and network to enable secure comms to those devices that can control load. And we have licenses and industry codes that regulate those parties that wish to communicate with devices. We have an assurance framework to ensure that those devices and organisations and communications all adhere to the rules that we set down. And we have that ongoing governance process to ensure that end-to-end controls remain appropriate and the security is at all times maintained. So with that in mind, I'd just like to give you the key takeaways that given the similar nature of the challenges and threats and risks that both smart EV chargers and actually all their associated participants' devices have with smart metering, there are many lessons that can be learned from the implementation of smart metering, along with the potential reuse of existing approaches, frameworks and solutions. And then without that, any solution that can impact energy C&I that wants to operate with security and interoperability will likely need to have similar controls to those that we have implemented in smart metering. And the reason I say that is that the approach we've gone through for smart metering is based upon detailed analysis of the risks and threats, many of which will apply to smart EV chargers and other devices and entities. And although the approaches to mitigating some of these risks may be different, the outcomes are all likely to be very similar. So hopefully that's been quite a whistle-stop tour through, and I know I've delved into some quite detailed aspects there. But that pretty much concludes the core areas I wanted to cover. And I'm aware that there was quite a lot of information in there, so I'm happy to take some sort of questions now. If Myriam, you'd like to sort of open up the floor.
Thank you so much, Daryl, for this extensive presentation. Yes, please, if the participants have questions, leave them in the chat box and I'll read them out to Daryl. Meanwhile, you've just presented a robust and extensive framework, governments, codes, etc. How long it took from the decision to start having those smart meters to get to that point? And the people who were involved in this process, did they look at other sectors to develop what we have right now for the smart metering system?
So I think for smart metering, we were sort of the first to be effectively putting devices into people's homes throughout sort of the nation and connecting them up to a network. So we were a bit of a trailblazer within that regard. So ensuring we did it properly took time. So whenever you're looking at creating standards and things, that can take sort of a couple of years, and then building the infrastructure to be secure can take a little bit of time as well. So that could be a sort of a year or 2 years to get everything in and working. So it's not a quick process. So that's why I sort of went to a bit of detail to explain that we've gone through a lot of that pain and have this sort of architecture and this assured platform in place. But if a new security risk is going to be introduced that can have similar impacts, then if it doesn't follow the same approach, then it's still going to need to meet those outcomes somehow. So in order to be interoperable, you're going to need to have technical specifications. In order to be secure, you're going to need to have risk assessments, and you're going to need to do trust modeling exercise and design an architecture that enables all of those things to take place. So I think that leads back to my key point really, in that if you want to do it properly, it's not quick and easy to do it in isolation on its own. But the benefit of having a smart metering network there is that actually we've done all of that already. and we are able to sort of take on new aspects and evolve that network as we need to.
Have anyone done a comparison to smart metering programs in other countries?
I think there has been comparisons done across sort of different governments. Different countries have taken different approaches and they have different outcomes. So from a smart metering point of view in the UK, our rollout is sort of energy supplier led because they own the end customer. In other countries where it's more nationally run, it's run by the network operators. So there's potentially sort of more freedom to just do it as part of an infrastructure rollout in those regards. And I think from a smart metering point of view in the UK, we have the other aspects such as prepay that are integrated and being able to sort of switch load. So other countries don't have the ability to switch load, so therefore don't have the CNI impact that we have, which is why we need to build all those controls in. But that ability to switch load has now given us that sort of step forward, if you like, to be able to adopt other things such as smart EV chargers through the smart metering network.
In those countries where the smart meters does not allow you to switch load, it automatically removes the smart metering infrastructure as an option to control EV chargers.
Yes, absolutely. They're effectively just sending back meter reads for billing purposes. So therefore, a lot of those organisations, and I think I was listening to one of the webinars last week in Holland. So the main amounts of their smart meters that have their sort of smart EV chargers are done at the moment, and now they're going to have to look to make them sort of smart and then look at a way to securely integrate them. So different countries have done it in different ways, but I'd like to think the UK are sort of ahead of the game in that regard because we've got a network that's sort of built ready to start beginning those aspects.
But there are drawbacks to the network. Yes, it is robust. You've showed how much work has gone into it. However, it might limit innovation. You mentioned in your talk that right now only suppliers can send supply affecting commands. However, there will be changes in the future to widen access above energy suppliers and above network operators. Why hasn't happened yet?
Because there wasn't a use case for it. When
okay,
we
so
did
what
smart,
does it, okay.
when we did smart metering, the only people. Sorry, go on, Myriam.
Yeah. So okay, it hasn't happened yet. There's no use case for it. Now there is a use case for it. How long it takes and what does it need for us to get small, innovative players to be able to play that game using the platform.
So what we're seeing in our pilots is that what we're having is the small innovative players are partnering up with energy suppliers. Because energy suppliers are the regulated entity, they're working with all these innovative players that have all their innovative technologies, and they're using the energy supplier and going through that mechanism at the moment. Now, going forwards, if there's a party that wants to control load, then there's the opportunity to extend the smart energy code and to extend the technical requirements to enable that to take place. And when I say it's only energy suppliers, it's purely because it's controlling load from an energy point of view. So when other people need to come in to control that load, you need to understand what conflicts might occur. So if there are two parties that could control load, who has the primary aspect? But there are the opportunities to have sort of separate devices in homes as well for devices that are controlling, say, a smart EV charger that's different to the devices that are controlling the smart metering system. And so you can have different entities controlling those different aspects.
Okay, so in the future, an aggregator could become a party that is able to send commands to affect the supply.
Absolutely. I think the main thing is that we've got the smart energy code and it's a framework and it's a set of rules. If we want to change that and enable other parties to come in, then that's all within industry's realm. It's the industry that look after the smart energy code. It's not government owned. So whether it's charge point operators, whether it's aggregators, whether it's demand side response service providers, there's the opportunity to create those new roles, as we would call them in smart metering, that give them the ability to manage that load. But obviously, when you're adding them to the system, it needs to be done in a sort of considered and careful way to ensure that there are no sort of conflicts of interest in terms of commands being sent to meters.
So we could see, if we see in the secondary legislation that we are going to use, because this is the proposed lead option of government, to use the smart metering system as a solution for smart charging. So if we do see that legislated, then maybe we can see more advancement on changing the smart energy code to allow these new players to participate.
Absolutely, and I think, like I say, it's only a minded to position from government at the moment, and there's additional consultation that's needed from sort of OLEV to come to its conclusions. But if we take, for example, the APC, the standalone proportional controller that I mentioned, so we added that into the tech specs within the space of a few months. That will then be available as of November. So the ability to get some technical specifications in quickly and to get products built can be done quickly within the smart energy code. It just needs to have sort of decisions made to say, okay, this is what we're going to do, and then we can kick some of those things off. So the important thing is that the framework and the rules and everything is there. Tailoring those rules going forward is absolutely the option, and that's why we built the smart metering system in that way.
And from looking at how many documents there are and like the process, it does seem complicated. And we're not saying it shouldn't. Obviously, the security of critical national infrastructure is important, and if it needs to be complicated, then it should be. But then if you have companies arguing that they can ensure that they are following cybersecurity best practices to control chargers without going through the robust smart metering system, what can we say to them?
Yeah, so all I can give you is our experience. And in our experience, having a set of rules and leaving those rules to the enforcement of industry doesn't always yield the results. So from a smart metering point of view, having independent assurance has absolutely meant that it's been quite challenging for a lot of participants because they are being tested against those obligations that they need to adhere to.
Yeah.
And it's there for that reason that you do get that independent assurance and everyone is held to the same level. And we still look at all of those core industry standards. We still look at 27001 and BS 7858 and all those good things that people should do. All we say is that we have someone come in independently and check that you're doing those things correctly.
Yeah.
And I think if you think of it from a historic point of view, if we take energy suppliers, for example, historically they were retail organisations. They own the customer and they build the customer based on energy supply. I'm talking about the retail part of their business. But then when you stick a smart meter in somebody's home to control energy supply, they then are required to, or they're a part of the critical national infrastructure. So their role completely changes from being a retail billing organisation to a C&I organisation. And that therefore means that certain behaviours and mindsets need to change, certain processes need to change. So having it regulated and having it in a position where it's independently assured actually helps that organisation to ensure that it's meeting the requirements, because fundamentally they're a different operating business as soon as they can affect C&I.
Okay, yeah. From the perspective of some technical requirements of energy and power services, how long it takes for an informational object to go through the smart meter, the DCC, to the aggregator, for example, and then for the control command to go back?
So I'm not sort of a deep techie end-to-end, but I'll try and complete where I can. So, I mean, the comms hubs that are in smart metering systems in every home, they're capable of delivering commands within 15 seconds. Obviously, they batch up data blocks for consumption data in 30-minute periods. They can deliver those within sort of 15 seconds. But within that, that's end-to-end. But within that home area network, so if there are sort of other devices like smart energy appliances or EV chargers, then that's below 11 seconds because you're going over the HAN rather than over the WAN network.
Okay, maybe last open-ended question, maybe. I've read the initial response to the consultation that you mentioned, and many respondents highlighted both benefits and drawbacks of the approach of using the smart metering system. Do you think we could see a future where the smart metering system is not used?
I I think from my point of view, from a Smith point of view, we wouldn't like to see that outcome because of all of the effort that's gone into creating that secure platform. We believe it's ready to go as is in certain use cases and can be extended to work in most use cases. But I think I'd go back to probably my last point on the sort of key takeaways, that if the smart metering system weren't to be used, then something that looks very much like all of those controls in the middle is still going to be required. So somebody is going to have to build all of that trust capability with PKIs or whatever technology or federated technology that's used. Somebody's going to have to implement anomaly detection capabilities. Someone's going to have to implement all of those authorizations and authentications. And so even without using smart metering, if it's not smart metering, then something very similar to it will have to take its place because of the impact to grid. So with that in mind, the options are obviously always open, and that's why OLEV are sort of taking their time now to review all of those consultation responses, to inform what their policy decisions will be, and there'll be subsequent consultations going out to take all of that information on board before government comes out with a defined position.
Yeah. It's after 5, but I have a couple of other questions on the chat box. Are you okay to take them?
Absolutely, yeah.
And I must say that you've received so many thank yous for your excellent presentation. So if you have a chance, just have a look at the chat box.
Thank you very much.
One question is, isn't it likely that third-party home automation tools, example, Alexa, will end up controlling domestic load to the same extent, but it is unregulated?
I think that's absolutely a risk. Yeah, definitely. And I think when we're looking from a wider government point of view on how things could impact the grid and how things can impact energy supply, those types of entities on a large scale will need to be looked at some point. I think the ability to control load is going to be very diverse and in many different areas with many different actors. And I think like any sort of burgeoning market, there's always going to be those aspects where new things come up with new ways of doing things. And in the early forms and the early stages of those aspects, I think that's fine because the risk is low. I think as those risks start to increase, when the volumes start to increase, when a potential impact to supply can become quite large, that's when there's a need to look at those things a little bit closer and identify whether additional security controls are required. But that's part of the reason to go through that methodical process that I outlined in my slides, really, so that you're applying proportionate controls in the right places, so that we're not overly regulating in areas where we don't need to, that we're not mandating security controls that, whilst they may seem great on the surface, actually increase cost or increase impact when we don't need them to.
Thank you. Last question. Can the smart metering network be considered to communicate with other non-smart meter related devices in the consumer premises to provide additional non-energy meter related services, such as information from sensors?
So I think ultimately, yes. So we have consumer access devices which basically any device that connects to the home area network. So the purpose of those really is to take read-only information from the meter. But those devices could be built out into sort of any function, if you like, that could use information from the consumption aspects to any sort of use case out of that for other devices or other actuators and things like that.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much, Daryl. Any parting thoughts?
No, just I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to sort of share the work we've done on smart metering. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to sort of deal with them all over email that they didn't get time for during the session.
My pleasure. Thank you, Daryl, and thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.